food affection and food perception. James is working on consumer and sensory research in our department, and apart from that, his additional research interests include food processing and chemistry. We will be taking questions at the end of James's presentation, so I'm going to ask you to keep your mic on mute. If you have any question, we can do that via chat or raise hands at the end of the presentation. Thank you, James.
Thank you, Marisa, for that part, for the introduction. So I'm going to load my presentation now.
I'm also supposed to be participating, by the way. But should haven't been able to.
All right, request that we move next, please.
We had the first one.
Marisa, can you see my presentation now?
I can see your presentation. You need to go to the presenter's view.
Because it's session is 1 hour.
I just request that you make sure that your mic is on mute. Thank you very much. James. Thanks, James. We can see the slide.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I realize that I will have to do these things doubly at meeting as well, people. So and then starting. All right, so my presentation, guys, is going to be on food affection and food perception. The topic has been put already by Marisa to you. Let me just start by taking note of Dr. Ina Risvik from Nofima in Norway for his tremendous contribution to this presentation. He was actually supposed to be presenting it, but due to circumstances beyond our control, he's not able to make the presentation. So I'm presenting it myself. So I'll start with this slide. You see there's a baby. Of course, for ethical reasons, we tried to manipulate it a bit, but the baby is enjoying, the child is enjoying. It seems it's a cup of milk or a beverage, whatever it is. And the first child is showing that he or she is enjoying it. And that's what relates actually to food affection and food perfection. How does food affect you, your feelings, your emotions, your attitudes, and things like that? So we're gonna start with the team at the University of Pretoria working in sensory research. It's really a big team, but I'm going to mention here a few that are actively and directly involved in the InnoFoodAfrica project. So, of course, myself, James Makame, I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the InnoFoodAfrica project, but previously for my PhD, my topic was the nutritive, rheological, and sensory quality of some African indigenous complementary foods that are used to feed infants and young children early in life. So we've been working with African indigenous foods for quite some time now as a research unit, sensory research, as a Department of Consumer and Food Science, and as a university, the University of Pretoria. The principal investigator is Professor de Kock, who is also the team leader for sensory related tasks in the InnoFoodAfrica project. I am sure now we all know Maris Kenya. She's a senior research scientist, sensory, in our department. She has been with the university for more than 10 years. And of course, in this project, we also have PhD students, Nomzamo, Nishani, Charmaine, Mariam Nakito, and some master students. We have Annalise Stein, and honor students as well, Christy, Clarissa, Lucy. And on top of that, we have a mentor and an advisor from Finland, Professor Yeli Torila. She's an extraordinary professor in the department. So that's basically the team that we are working with within the InnoFoodAfrica project context. So what is the topic for the project? InnoFoodAfrica, locally driven co-development of plant-based value chains towards more sustainable African food systems with healthier diets and export potential. So that is the topic for the project. It's a 3-year project that is going up to 2023. So in this project, sensory and consumer science is going to be very important. And this is why we want to discuss food affection and food perception at the level of sensory and consumer science. How is food affection going to be related to plant-based foods? How is it going to be related to sustainable foods? How is it going to be related to African indigenous food crops? How can we use sensory for healthier diets and for enhancing export potential? So in this slide is the same that is shown already. So I'm going to pass this one and move on to this one, which is food affection or hedonics. So in this case, we are talking about consumer acceptance and preferences. Remember in the previous session last week, Riet talked about, as well as Paula, they talked about different types of consumer tests, quantitative, analytical, descriptive tests, as well as preference tests. So food affection falls under the consumer acceptance or consumer preference tests. So experiencing pleasure is an important part of a normal healthy life. And it is essential for the well-being of individuals. In the context of food, we know that there's what we call anticipatory pleasure. To say that when you are in a restaurant, for example, or even at your home, you are about to consume food, when the food is being prepared, or when you are in a food environment, the odors, the aromas that reach your nose, the appearances, the colors, the textures, whatever you see with your eyes, all those sensory cues tend to affect your liking of your food, tend to affect your attitude towards the food. So that's what we call anticipatory pleasure, which means if the food is smelling well, you want to eat it. There's a liking to eat it. If the food is not smelling well, the aromas are not that good, you want to avoid it. You don't want to buy it. You don't want to engage with it. Now, another aspect is consummatory pleasure. This is now when you are eating the food, in the process of eating, consuming the food. We know that the food oral processing is a dynamic process, a process whereby the attributes tend to change along the eating trajectory from one attribute to another. But along that journey, how is the food changing? How is that affecting your liking of the food? Are you going to like it more? Are you going to like it less? So that's what we are dealing with when we talk of food affection and food hedonics. So hedonics are important because they guide behavior. In this case, we are talking about consumer behavior in terms of food consumer behavior, food consumption behavior. If the food is good, I'm going to buy it. If the food is good, I'm going to eat it. If it is good and healthy, it means if you eat it, and then you enhance your healthiness and your well-being. Hedonics also affect decision making. Remember, when you're making food choices, there are decisions that you take. So we need to understand food affection and food perception to inform our decision-making process as we interact and engage with food and the food environment. They also help in inducing learning I think later we're going to talk about how we can learn about food affection, to like the food that we previously did not like. So food that meets our expectations is what we need as consumers. It seems that probably by way of culture, we have set within our mind certain standards and specifications about food characteristics to say that if the food is tasting like this, it is acceptable. If the food has this texture, it is acceptable. If it deviates from those characteristics or specifications, it becomes dislikable. It becomes a displeasure. The eating experience becomes an unpleasurable experience. So people, consumers, expect food to meet their internal quality expectations. So food affection is actually a quality issue. And remember, affection is about a feeling towards something. In this case, a feeling towards food. We also know that quality is a two-pronged aspect. It can be subjective, it can be objective. Objective sensory quality is where we talk about descriptive sensory evaluation. We're not going to focus on that. This talk is about subjective sensory quality under food affection. So if you look at this food that is shown in the picture, it looks, in my view, it looks nice. One may like to eat the food. To someone, it may not look nice. They may want to avoid the food. What are the consequences of avoiding good food? What are the consequences of liking food that is not healthy? So sensory perception and methods are covered in other lectures. And like I said before, this one is going to only focus on food affection and food perception. Now, the central question is, where does food affection reside in our brain? I think it's one of the difficult questions. When you say we like this food make me feel happy. This food make me feel disgust after eating it. This food make me imagine already smelling some certain sweet fragrances, sweet aromas, sweet odorances. Where does that processing happen in the brain, in the black box? So that's an explanatory gap. What we know now is that certain foods are associated with pleasurable experiences. They are associated with positive, affective experiences. But we do not know the mechanisms that happens inside the brain which lead people to have certain feelings towards certain foods. And that's an explanatory gap. And of course, we know that experts in different fields, especially in behavioral neuroscience in this respect, are busy trying to unlock and understand what happens when people like certain foods, what really happens in the brain. So currently there is no robust functional model for understanding hedonics, for understanding food liking and dislikes. But lucky enough, we have the correlations. And remember, correlations between food properties and food likings do not necessarily translate into causality. Higher R-squared correlation coefficients do not really translate into causality relationships. But nonetheless, they are very important. So that's the explanatory gap we have. And that's what we do not understand now. So one of the methods, one of the models of trying to understand food affection or food hedonics, to say what really happens in the black box, is based on the anatomy of the mind, whereby researchers think that the mind can be classified into two parts, the left brain and the right brain. And they say that they call it the logical left, which means it is focusing on analysis, it is logical, it is about language processing, and mathematical and things like that. And they say the right brain is the one that is focused on imagination, inspiration, music, ideation or idea creation, and it is a creative part of the mind. It is believed that it is in the right brain where food affection and food emotions and food imaginations arise and are processed. Remember, again, this is a model. There are so many models with scientists trying to explain the phenomenon about the world. So if you look in this picture, learning about wine, for me, one thing that quickly comes first to my mind is, wow, they're different. I can quickly pick the differences. But the next thing that comes is, I think I like either the first one or the second one or the third one. So what sensory scientists believe is that there's a big difference between using our brain to have an affective relationship to food and an analytical relationship to the same. So they say that humans cannot be in the affective and analytical mode at the same time, which means either you are in the affective, appreciating the food, or you are in the analytical, I'm sorry, analyzing, critically engaging the food. So that is very important for food product designers, for marketers, for anyone in the food system value chain to understand, because it helps in many ways, including in the design and conduct of sensory and consumer studies. So an analytical approach to food really changes the affective response. To say, if you say, I like the food, that brings a different perspective compared to say, if you start to describe the food, because that becomes analytical. Okay, so in this slide, we talk about childhood food aversions. To say, why do we think that children don't like food, and why is that important? There is a background to that. For example, we know that children, as they are born as babies, they are predisposed to like sweet foods, to like salt food, but they don't like bitter foods. And of course, that is because inside their mother's womb, they have exposure to these compounds and aromas and tastes through the amniotic fluid. So really, to change from do you like it to what does it taste, it makes a big difference. In this case, we can use the analytical approach to try and coach children to like some of the foods which we know that they're healthy, but children don't like. I'll explain that in the next slide. So in one study during my PhD, we analyzed the sensory properties of African indigenous complementary foods. And in this case, that was maize porridge at 10% solids content. So what we did, we used a normal method whereby the chewing was by an adult-like eating process. And in the other one at the bottom, we used the up and down method, which involves food oral processing by chewing using a process that tries to mimic baby eating. We found out that when we eat like a baby, the panelists tended to rate the food as too thick. That's why you see a thick black line from about 0 seconds to around after 20 seconds. They felt that, it's a feeling, they felt that it was too thick. But when it was eaten using the normal, the thickness was short-lived because they could break down the food orally with their mature oral physiology. So we did not move on to do extra experiments about food affect, that is the sensory consumer preference test and consumer acceptance test. But one can extrapolate to say if the food is too thick, and using literature as well, young children, because of their physiology, may not be able to handle that food. And that is very important in the InnoFoodAfrica project, because it means we can now modify our flours for African indigenous complementary foods to make sure that their sensory characteristics will be appealing and pleasurable for the target consumer group. So here there's a story about eating carrots with young children in a kindergarten setup. Now the educator asked for help to choose the least bitter carrot for lunch. It was a class of them, there were many of them. And they tested 4 varieties at first. And they discussed what they tasted and looked like. You see here that they focused on the analytical approach. They discussed how do they taste? How do they look like? What do they look like? And after 2 hours with carrots, they had exhausted the theme. Then the educator asked if they liked the carrots. Now the educator is shifting or switching to an affective approach from an analytical approach. Now the one who had eaten 2 big carrots said, I don't like carrots. I never eat them. But he had already eaten 2 big ones. So he is not realizing that he is already beginning to like the carrots. But what has been used is the affect approach first. Remember, they're not rating the intensity or whatever. They're just describing how they look like. They eat, they test, they describe them, they brainstorm. And then at the end, they ask the same question. They don't realize that already they're beginning to consume this. They say, he said, I don't like carrots. I never eat them. So it's one approach that can be used with children to overcome food aversions. Now, the story fits well with grown-ups as well. We know that unfamiliar food is often not liked by many people. And I think in one of the lecture series, Professor Eli Torilla is going to talk about, okay, it's the food choice questionnaire. I'm not sure if she's going to get into food neophobia in detail, but this relates to that. So to get to be familiar with the food that you don't like, we need intentional exposure, and that should be safe exposure as well. And if you read around literature, you know that people have used, for example, the repeated exposure method. Initially, you start with your consumers, the response rate, the affect is negative, they don't like it. The second exposure, liking is increasing. The third exposure, and without even knowing it, over some time, eventually they get to like the food which they previously had not liked. So that is the repeated exposure method. So the analytical approach is described here. It helps to defocus the affective dimension of the food. When you ask your participants to brainstorm what the food they don't like, taste like, feel like, look like, smell like, all those things, you are helping them by defocusing from what they do not like to focus on what it is actually. But in the long term, that also helps them to and apply it in the food. And that's good if the food is very healthy. Like in this case, we are developing plant-based foods from traditional African indigenous crops, most of which some people may not like for one reason or another. So it is an approach to train the mind how to like new foods, like testing in training schools. So that was about it for food affection. But food affection is closely related to food perception. In fact, these two are difficult to divorce from each other, because remember, perception you are responding to the stimulus of the food. For example, you're answering the question, what do you perceive? You are responding to the characteristics of the food sensory attributes, but also there is an input from the mind, from the culture, from whatever happens in the black box, which we said we don't understand at the moment. So it is the environment, the food sensory properties, and also the previous exposure and many other factors, your education and things like that, which affect food perception. And remember, perceptions are not always correct. So we are going to look at some perspectives and not in detail. So why does almost everyone like French fries? So a good fry is one that is generally crisp on the outside and soft on the inside. So this is the mental construct or specification that most consumers have about a good quality crisp. It must be crisp. When you chew it, there must be a crispy sound, but inside it must be a bit soft. So that distinct texture is very important, and there's an expectation to find these characteristics in a good fry. But a poor one is soggy and soft and sometimes hard on the inside. The same applies here with texture. It must be as expected, and that is one reason why you find that most children do not like the carrots when you boil them, because by boiling you already change the structure of the carrot as fresh. It is no longer as hard textured as they know it. So that changes the sensory characteristics, and they're not used to that in their mind frame. So they do not know what to expect. Is it hard? Is it soggy? Is it soft? So it takes effort and courage to learn to like textures that remind us of something in decay, for example. Now, there's also another problem, especially amongst children, infants, not really infants in this case, young children and toddlers, not to like most of the vegetables, not only the brassica family, sometimes even amongst adult consumers. And this is because food high in bitterness are often associated with displeasure. They don't have a pleasurable experience, and hence they are disliked. Of course, there are so many reasons, the compounds that you found from them, in them, which leads to bitterness, like the glucosinolates and others. And the foods high in antioxidants and fibers are often bitter as well. Never mind the intensity of bitterness. We're not going to get into the details of that because it becomes analytical. But as long as there's a hint of bitterness, which is an affective attribute, an affective sensory attribute, people tend to shy away from that food. They don't want to eat it. So that's why sensory and consumer science is more complex, because it's multidisciplinary field. For example, in this case, we can use the approach of the reward and punishment theory of reinforcing behavior. If the food is good and likable, people will eat it and they will repeat the cells and they'll buy it again. If the food is unappealing and disliked, they're not going to buy it again. They're not going to try it again. They will avoid it. So it applies as well with grain foods. You know that they are high in fiber. Some have bitter compounds, and people may actually avoid them. But what we know is that fiber is good for health. It helps the GI functions, for example. So we need to find ways as sensory scientists and other stakeholders of encouraging, of training people to like those foods that are considered as unpleasurable sensorially, but they are known to have health promoting attributes. So in this case, we begin to see that food affection among us consumers is not the same. It is heterogeneous. Now, this is a recent article, Sensory Characteristics and Consumer Segmentation of Fried Sweet Potato for Expanded Markets in Africa. The authors found out, I think it was in Ghana or Kenya somewhere, but they found that testing different varieties of orange flaked sweet potato, they found that the consumers fall into 3 segments: cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3, using preference mapping. If you look at this map, you will see that perception is very important because there are color properties, there is oiliness, there is sogginess, there is sweetness, there is flavor. Those are perceptual attributes of the food, sensory perceptual attributes. But also there are preference aspects. What do they like? And there are some correlations between liking and perception. So you can't bunch consumers into one big group. They are always different. So that's why we have consumer segmentation. I know that some of the colleagues later on will talk about consumer segmentation. So food affection is important, but we need to know what really causes them to like what they like and what really causes them to dislike what they do not like. So what is true about our food affection behavior? What do we know? A lot of research continues to occur as we speak. In this case, I said beyond the 11-point hedonic scale. We know that 11-point hedonic scale is one psychological scale that has stood the test of time. But in this study, the authors wanted to find out what are the feelings and attitudes and emotions that are associated with chemosensory properties of food, that is taste and smell. So they use the scale which range, it is a Likert type scale that ranges from 1, which is very false for me, to 6, very true for me. So for those of you who know Stepto's food choice questionnaire, this is almost like that. And the question they asked are next page. The results. For example, they said, every time I smell food, I feel very happy. Is it very false for me? Is it very true for me? From 1 to 6. They found out that 3 main factor models emerged. One relates to food, which is the ability to experience pleasure while eating food. So that's very important to food scientists. That's very important to anyone along the food value system. Food sensory characteristics, food health perception characteristics, anything related to food, perhaps pricing and things like that, is very important in terms of food satisfaction, food affection, food liking, food emotions. So the next question they said, taste food makes me happy on that scale. You see that there are 4 factors with high correlation values there. And again, the next one was on imagination. What do you imagine? The ability to experience pleasure when anticipating food. You're in a restaurant, you're passing through a kitchen, a soup kitchen, the smells that affect you, you begin to imagine. So these guys found out that imagination in terms of sensory and consumer science is very important. And the third one was about the ability, nature, the ability to experience pleasure when smelling natural products. I think they were going beyond food in this case. So food affection is very important because if you understand these aspects, you can consider them in the design of your sensory and consumer research to optimize likability, pleasurable experiences when people are consuming the food. So it is possible, even though it's difficult, even though we agree that we don't have the mechanisms as yet to understand what goes on inside the black box, that is the mind, about hedonic responses, about food affection and perception. Still, we know that we can train people to a significant extent to like some of the foods which they don't like before. So what is the sensitive window for this? And I've alluded already to exposure of the infants and young children in utero to tastes and odors in their mother's diet. But we know that the most sensitive time period for training and coaching human beings is during infancy and childhood. And at this stage, exposure may lead to more positive hedonic responses in adulthood. And that's very important, because if we are able to train young people, infants, children at a very young age to like the foods that are healthy, but we know that they have sensory characteristics that perhaps we may not be able to modify, which make them shun away from consumers. It means that we can prevent non-communicable diseases later in life. It means that we can influence good health and well-being later on in life, and we can enhance good public health policies for our countries. So again, we can use repeated exposure methods here, which I'm sure most of you are aware of. So what are the implications for the design of novel plant-based foods of all we've talked about? It means that when we are designing plant-based foods, we must have all these questions at the back of our mind at each and every stage along the food value system. So InnoFoodAfrica, locally driven co-development of plant-based value food chains towards more sustainable African food systems. That's the topic, with healthier diets and export potential. We want to produce food products that can be exported to other countries, to other markets, but they must be sensorially acceptable. People must have an affective relationship with the foods produced in the project. But this is a challenge, because how to make palatable and good tasting foods with boring ingredients is always a problem, and we must continue to think about it. Lucky enough, we have the technologies already, we have some of the solutions already, but remember, they're not exhaustive. We keep on doing more research in this aspect. Thank you very much. We can have the questions now.
Thank you very much, James, for the very interesting topic. I don't know if there's any questions for James. You can share that in the comment box, or you can raise your hand if you want to ask it yourself. Any questions or comments? Just trying to see, it seems as
yes, there is a question from George Wilson. Kulaba, please go ahead.
The froze, but you can go ahead, James.
Yes, thank you for that wonderful presentation. I am asking, to what extent does color influence the affection food of young people, like babies, children? Hello?
Yes, I can hear you. And thank you for that question, George. Is that so? To what extent does color affect infants and young children as a consumer group? I think color is really very important, especially for those that are from kindergarten upwards, because we know that they like color, be it in foods, be it in clothing. There must be research on that. But certainly before that age, for infants and those that are not yet at kindergarten level, I don't think it might be very important. This is not a conclusive response because it seems it's a knowledge gap that people may want to explore, to find out. Remember, one of the difficulties in conducting research with young children is that they are not able to describe, to analyze, to say what exactly they experience about things. So in most cases, we rely on the guardians, the parents, the mothers, and things like that. But it's a very important question nonetheless. Thank you, George, for that.
I think I saw another hand that was raised, but I don't see it anymore. Was there another question for James? Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. James, for the wonderful presentation.
Okay, thank you.
I wanted more clarity. You talked of exposure as one of the methods that you can use to make children get used to some foods that appears to be less palatable or bitter. So what can you elaborate more on some of those methods?
All right, Jasper, it's a very key question. The methods that we can apply to try to nudge people, not only children, to like and less palatable foods, but which are healthy. What is more commonly reported in literature is the repeated exposure method. I think most of us are aware of that. But I think as well that if we try to use multiple techniques, for example, we combine the foods that are less liked with those that are liked fairly well, perhaps that can help. By that I mean doing that maybe in formulation, putting some of the ingredients that are less liked into those that are fairly well developed. I think it's beginning to happen in the insect as food cluster, whereby insect powders are being put into some baked products and other products to try and nudge people and persuade them to like such foods. I'm just thinking about what are some of the things. Also, maybe processing techniques. There are processing techniques that can change the sensory characteristics of the plant-based foods or any other food to make them more appealing, more palatable, and more pleasurable for the target consumer. Perhaps that can help. One should not forget, however, that in doing that, for example, if you use heat treatments, maybe in the process you break down the health promoting compounds and things like that, but that's a different topic from what we're talking about now. But we need to think about all those things. I think offhand, that's what I can think about for now. Do we have any more questions, please?
Thanks, James. There's some questions in the chat. I'll read them to you. There's a question from Henry Baggs. Thank you for the presentation, James. How does presentation of a food affect affection and perception?
Yes, and that's very interesting. So this is why, you know, many brains, when they come together, the impact is additive. Is bring about another important aspect. Food presentation obviously affects liking and the affect towards food. There are many papers, published research around that to say the way you present the food during serving and the way you plan your menus, all those aspects have a bearing on whether the food is going to be liked less or whether it's going to be liked more, and whether there are going to be repeat engagements with different aspects of food. So that's a very important consideration. Indeed, it affects the food affection and food perception aspects. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, James. There's another question. I'll read it. Thank you, James, for the nice presentation. Would you please substantiate more on the link between exposure during fetal stage and NCD in later life?
If I get the question, is asking about the link between baby's exposure in utero to different sensations, taste and smell, and things like that, and the non-communicable diseases later on in life. It's a complex question, and it's a very relevant question in today's world. Why I say so is because it seems that, I'll be cautious here because I don't have full knowledge about it, but it seems that most of the exposures in utero, whether it's exposure or predisposition, tend to be sweet or reasonably salty and good flavors and odors. You see, things that are more pleasurable. When babies are born, when infants come into this world, they come with those attributes to like sweet things, perhaps as an evolutionary aspect to drive them towards energy-dense food, energy-providing food, and to avoid bitter ones, which may be poisons. So what we find is that it seems later on in life, most non-communicable diseases are because people are relying on foods that are sweet, and obviously most of them, which are sweet, are energy dense, and of course that leads to NCDs, and they avoid those that tend to be bitter and unpleasurable. And we know that most of them are plant-based, and they help in preventing non-communicable diseases, including cardiovascular diseases, including some types of cancers and things like that. So it seems there is that link to say when people are when they're born, they are born liking certain groups of foods sensorially and shunning away certain groups of foods, and later on relating to non-communicable diseases. However, it seems there is more work that needs to be done to establish, as you say, can I substantiate, to establish whether that link can be traced right in utero when children are not yet born, or is to the effect of the food environment when people are already born.
Thank you, James. Any more questions for James on this very interesting topic?
I see George Wilson, or is the previous question?
I think it was the previous question.
Okay.
There's a hand raised by James Shakwir. Oh, sorry, I wouldn't be able to.
Chakwizira, you're welcome, please.
Sorry, it's Wembai. I'm using my husband's laptop. Okay. Is it possible to find the attributes of flavor, like when you're doing a choice experiment?
You said, is it possible to define or refine?
To research on the attributes of, say, for instance, flavor, when you're doing a choice experiment.
Yes, it's very possible. Remember, most of the flavor attributes are already there in literature. So I do not want to get into much detail at the moment because this was on food affection. But when you're leaning towards quantitative descriptive analysis, for example, you see that people generate their own attributes about products, and then they go to literature to find what is already there, and then they validate and see eventually which products applies to their situation. So I think, yes. I'm not sure if Marisa, you want to add on that one?
I agree with what you've shared.
Thank you, Marisa.
Any more questions? The recording of the presentation, James, will it be available on the website, or will you share it with the participants?
The recording will be shared with the participants, and the slides will be available on the InnoFoodAfrica website. That's the latest agreement.
Okay. I think if there are no more questions, we can end today's meeting. I would like to thank everyone that participated. Thank you, James, also for your effort and for sharing your knowledge with us. Yes, and I look forward to future presentations on the IFA Sensory Training Toolbox.
Thank you so much, Marisa, and thank you to all the participants for signing up. Now we can stop the recording. Thank you so much. See you in the next set of presentations. Thank you so much, guys.
The next presentation will be next week,